What's up, guys? Happy Sunday night. Good to see y'all too again. So I'm always happy to be joined by Kyle Walton. Welcome, Kyle, back to Refounding
Hey, how
Pod.
you doing, guys?
And Chris Souza. How you doing, Chris? Good to see you again, brother.
Doing pretty well. How about you?
Doing great. So looks like we got 3 or 4 folks that have already logged in online. You can see we got a little banner here going across the bottom. Let us know where you're watching from. Let us know your thoughts on the election because we're going to be talking about our reactions to that all night. Have a show here for about 20, 25 minutes, just kind of going through that. But let me ask you guys, we did so many different episodes talking about this election and what we thought was going to happen. We each made predictions. We talked about that. It felt like ad nauseum. And now it's occurred. And Kyle, I was so happy to have you on for our election show. That was a blast. So we got to hear a little bit of your thoughts, and we'll come back to that for sure. But let me ask you, Chris, given the fact that most of the major news outlets are saying that Biden will be the next president, let's get your immediate reactions to this, man. What did you think?
Think is a really strong word there, as I just kind of felt a very emotional rush
Yeah.
and just a sense of calm and relief. I sent you a picture earlier of my wife and I.
Oh, I got that. Let's pull it up here. There's Chris. Yeah.
Yes, with our Biden-Harris sign.
Is that your mimosas? Is that what you got going on there? What's that, brother?
Our no malarkey mimosas, yes.
Oh, good.
The era of big malarkey is over, and we look forward to a malarkey-free future. That's what I believe in. That's what Joe Biden believes in.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, click the video again there. So I can understand that that you were thrilled with that result. How about you, Kyle? I want to give some another chance for you to kind of talk about some of the things that you did on election night. I know. Going back to some of your predictions, you talked about the possibility of a red wave and Trump even winning the popular vote. We're going to get into those numbers, but your kind of immediate reactions as to what you saw play out.
Yeah, I can't say that I was too shocked. This is always a possibility. I thought I could count on the notoriously unreliable youth vote, but good on them. They showed up, and they showed up in numbers. Voting registration was made easier in a lot of states, and that's not a bad thing. And definitely got a lot more voters for Trump, which was a prediction that I had. But I did not see the overwhelming numbers coming in for Biden that showed up.
Yeah. So we'll look at some of the numbers. I got to tell you, the things that we had our live show the night that the election actually occurred, and we were pretty certain that it wouldn't be called that night, but. Man, I was checking CNN and Fox and MSNBC. It felt like every hour for the next 2 or 3 days, and I'm still checking it at least a couple times a day to get updates on what's happening because it was just so close. And let's look at the numbers here as we go into this and take a look. There's so many things that surprised me. There's so much to talk about with this election. The first thing I got to say is, look how close it was. And in some ways still is. We don't really have the final numbers. As you can see, this is from CNN just a few minutes ago. You can see that there's still technically several states that are in doubt. But, even when you get into these states, the numbers were so close, especially in places like Georgia. Arizona could be even closer. It's you can see how that's been whittling down. So North Carolina, Pennsylvania, of course, we're going to have to talk about. It was amazing. And to your point, both of you guys, to refresh those people who are watching live, I had predicted a 269 tie, and there was a chance that could happen at one point. I know Kyle had predicted that Trump would win the election, would win the popular vote, and then Chris had predicted that Biden would win pretty substantially. And, I see aspects of all of that. I see, look at Florida. That's the first thing I want to talk about. Is Florida went red really early. It felt like very shortly after we went off live. I think we went off around 9 p.m. Central Time is when we went off live, and I'm pretty sure Florida was called, which is very different than 2016, and that was a huge boost to Trump winning Florida early. Ohio, right, went for Trump. Several of these other states. Texas. At one point, remember, Texas was sort of in doubt. Some of the polling had Texas pretty close.
That's
That was
right. Yeah.
Trump. So
South
I mean,
Carolina too. Yeah.
South Carolina, yeah. So like several of these states went red early. So this is by no means do I see this as a huge defeat or loss for Republicans or Trump himself, because several of these states that were in doubt or could have been down either by the polls or by 2016 numbers went his way, right? So clearly that Trump energized his base and they came out. But then we get into some of these other states, and one of the things I just got to get your reactions to was I couldn't believe that Fox called Arizona as early as they did. That shocked me, and even CNN did not call. Still hasn't technically called Arizona. Look, it's great. This is
Right.
from just about an hour ago. Still hasn't technically called Arizona, and Fox did, and they just refused to back out, even as it went down to somewhere in the neighborhood of I think 20,000 votes. That shocks me. Did that shock you guys?
Not necessarily. I'm a little shocked that Florida called it so early. Wes's home state of Florida. What's going on in Kyle's home state of North Carolina that even Florida's ahead of them as far as projecting the winner there? That was very surprising.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're an odd bunch here in the Carolinas. Actually, one of my predictions is looking like it's going to come true, where Trump's going to carry the state, but ultimately the Democrat incumbent governor is going to hold on. So listen, when it comes to North Carolina politics, yeah, who knows how things shake out, man.
Yeah, I think that was very surprising. I mean, I do think North Carolina's going to go for Trump. I think he'll get those votes for sure. But it certainly was in doubt. I mean, there was times where they thought Virginia was in doubt, because up until Fairfax County was called, it was going red. And we've got to get into at some point just how this election played out, because so many of the votes that came in for Biden came in from people who weren't voting in person. And I think that's kind of common knowledge now. I was watching CNN in particular, breaking that down about how many votes were coming in late, especially in places like Pennsylvania, where so many people, voted by mail, and then they didn't even start counting some of them in Pennsylvania in particular until Election Day. Whereas some of the other states, they were counting them as they came in early, up to like a week early. In Pennsylvania, it wasn't until Election Day. So you had this Trump sweep in Pennsylvania, in other battleground states, and then it started to change dramatically as those votes became, part of the count that they were releasing. And that dynamic has just been so controversial. It's upset so many people, because watching it change from red to blue, based upon people counting these ballots and trusting them to do that, as opposed to someone who puts their ballot in the computer system themselves. It's causing a lot of heartache on the right. So any thoughts on that, Kyle?
Yeah, when I went to bed, I was feeling pretty good. When I woke up on Wednesday morning, the first thing I did was check my phone to look at the electoral map, and I had called it perfect so far. My prediction was spot on, with the exception of Fox News calling Arizona. With that, I was 49 for 50, otherwise 50 for 50. But as the week has stretched on, my prediction has definitely turned a little bit.
Yeah.
I lost a couple of the battleground states I was expecting, like Michigan, Pennsylvania specifically, Nevada as well. Yeah, it's been an interesting thing. I obviously there is some aspects of voter fraud we're going to get into, but I don't think it's going to account for, many thousands of votes, let alone numbers. Yeah, watching it was definitely a little nerve-wracking for sure, but we got to count every legal vote for sure.
Yeah. And then for you, Chris, at what point would you say that you felt some kind of, what point did you believe Biden had won the election? Were you nervous, going into this, right?
Yeah,
watching that dynamic. Yeah.
I definitely was not confident on Tuesday night, which is why I kind of had to disengage from politics for the night. Although you guys did a great election night show. I did catch up on that. Games looked super fun. So that was great. Yeah. I'm sad to miss out on that. But at the same time, that night, I just kind of had to de-stress, not think about it. My wife and I watched the 1998 witch movie, Practical Magic, which should be recommended by doctors as a muscle relaxant, because it really did help me take my mind completely off of this very stressful election. I felt a lot better the next morning. And as the week progressed, I really started to believe that Biden pretty much had this in the bag. It turns out telling your supporters not to vote by mail is not a great re-election strategy. Just as, telling them not to wear a mask or social distance during a pandemic is not a great election strategy. So I would like to see and take a peek into the alternate universe where everything else was the same, but Trump actually encouraged vote by mail, to maybe see, did things shake out a little bit differently there. But, he's talking about there's voter fraud because all these mail-in ballots came in for Biden when he specifically told his supporters not to vote by mail. So, it'll be interesting to see the results, if any of his lawsuits are any more successful than the 10 that have already been rejected by courts in the past few days. I found out yesterday while I was golfing. I was in the same place Trump was when he found out, which was at a golf course. Yeah. And very excited to see that news after several days of, bated breath.
Yeah. But then at the same time, when we look at the numbers for the Senate and the House, Democrats made no gains in the House. They actually lost seats. And then it doesn't appear there's still going to be recounts, and then there's going to be runoffs, it looks like, in Georgia. But they certainly didn't make the type of gains in the Senate that many had expected. So when you look at this as, is this a blue win or a Democratic win? Obviously you have the presidency, what we're talking about, but, Biden's going to very likely face, number one, a Senate that is still Republican and a Supreme Court that is stacked with conservative justices, right? So, I totally get, the elation, and you're happy that, Trump's going to very likely be out of the presidency, but at the same time, it's not like the government has gone blue, right? There's still huge parts of it that are mixed.
And I think that lends credence to my theory that I've had for quite a while, that a big deciding factor in this election was going to be never Trump Republicans, or Republicans who were turned off by the man at the top, who would still vote Republican down ballot. Yeah. So I think that really explains why Trump lost, but we did not see significant gains in the House or really the Senate for that matter. So I think that, I've said all along, a lot of people have been urging Biden to move more to the left, to appeal to, the far leftists, to not condemn rioting done by the more extreme factions, or at least condoned by the more extreme factions of Black Lives Matter and Antifa. And I always kind of had this kind of doubt that would make any difference, because from the reactions I was seeing on Twitter and other social media, Antifa hates Joe Biden. The far left hates Joe Biden. The right kind of tried to manufacture this hatred of Joe Biden that didn't really take off. And I think really what saved this was Republicans who were just sick of Trump.
Your reaction, Kyle?
Yeah, I think Chris is right on a couple of different points there. One, because it was not a blue wave, because Democrats didn't make great strides in Congress, I think you can point to this perhaps being a referendum on Trump himself. Not necessarily Trumpism. I think aspects of Trumpism, which is basically just a national populism, I think that will live on. And I think that, if the Republicans can get someone with a better temperament and someone with a little bit of discipline, that a lot of the aspects of Trumpism can live on and move on. But obviously, I think this is a referendum on Trump himself. Yeah. And we saw that play out.
Well, one of the things that I was thinking is for the mail-in ballots, so many of those, I think, were decided earlier, obviously than Election Day. And how you go back to that time, there was a period where Trump really was lower in the polls. And then we saw him starting to surge. And I'll show the polls here real quick. Is that these are some of the polls right before the election. And you see right here was Biden leading in several states, Ohio and Texas. Trump had a lead. And then what we saw just a couple days after this was that lead start to shift even more towards Trump in the last few hours. There was polls coming in. Look at this. You had Georgia less than a point. That's what we're seeing, right? It was just fascinating. Iowa was very close. Arizona, you see Biden just barely leading. A lot of these were very, very close. And then, of course, Trump surging at the end. And I think a lot of that was based upon Mike Pence's debate and then Trump's second debate, where he was very different than he was in the first one. He reminded people in his second debate that he could be more statesmanlike. He could, respect the moderator, which he did, and he could engage. And it also, in that debate, I think we talked about it, that Biden didn't do as well. Part of that was because he was having to talk a lot more as opposed to the first one where he was being interrupted constantly. And even the hardest Trump supporters really had a problem with that first debate. And if that's when you were voting was after that first one, Trump had just coming off COVID, wasn't looking great, in terms of where he was at in the polling, right? There's a vote right there as opposed to Election Day where he kind of shoring that gap. Biden had made the comments, if you recall, in the second debate about the oil industry. And Trump was like, pay attention to this, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. Yeah. But for those people who mailed in, they'd already voted. They weren't going to change and either not vote or switch their vote, right? And so I think that kind of threw things as well differently is the timing of doing these mail-in ballots. 3 weeks, 2 weeks can make all the difference between someone who's motivated to vote versus not. So just a very unique election. And I wonder if Trump had performed in his first debate the way that he had done in his second, if he would have carried a state like Georgia and maybe Arizona, right? In which case, again, who knows if that would have, he would have needed more than that to be able to win this election, but it could have been even closer than what we have now. So just interesting how it actually played out and how that dynamic occurred. But now we got to get into the concept of voter fraud, because that really is, where Trump is at. If you recall, back in 2016, Trump was already talking about voter fraud, even though he won the election, didn't win the popular vote, and commissioned people to go look at that. They didn't really come away with much. Now what we're seeing is lawsuits in every one of these gray states, as well as Pennsylvania, which is really what swung it over the top for Biden. So talk to me about that, Kyle. What have you learned about voter fraud? What are your thoughts on it? How prevalent do you think it is in this election?
Well, obviously it exists. Corey Lewandowski in their press conference today gave a specific example of a woman who was deceased but still received a ballot, and the state received a filled out ballot several days after she had passed away. So obviously voter fraud is a real thing. However, I think that it is likely to about the same effect or has the same effect as what most on the left think when they shout voter suppression, right? I don't think it's to the tune of several million votes, let alone several tens of thousands of votes even. It exists. Obviously, we need to figure out a better way to vote. I think it's a clear takeaway from this election that we've got to come up with a better solution. But yeah, so I think it exists, but I don't necessarily think that it's to the tune of millions of votes or really even enough to sway a national election.
Well, so, my thought for this, Chris, I agree with what Kyle's saying, is that I do think that voter fraud exists. The degree to which it's prevalent is another question. But what's fascinating me, too, about the coverage of this election is there was kind of this delay from CNN and Fox and MSNBC and all these other news networks to call the election, even when by the numbers it was pretty clear that things were going in Biden's direction. And then all of a sudden they all, kind of called it. It felt like within an hour or two. As they all called it, they all said, it's over. And then immediately on CNN, the coverage was, it's settled, it's done, there's really nothing else to look into. And, this election, every vote is legitimate, and it's, there's nothing really else to see here. And I thought that was really fascinating coming from the center and coming from the left, especially from the left, because how much attention was paid into Russian hacking and foreign interference and all of this for years. There was questions about this.
Yeah,
there
right.
So many, House investigations and things like that came through, and people saying, hey, we've got to fight for the integrity of our election. And now it seems like there's almost no patience from the left for people, talking about Pennsylvania, which has a long history of corruption in terms of state and local elections. So, where do you stand on this? Do you think that there is, that any time or effort should be spent, or are you one of those folks that says, move on, nothing to see here?
I am totally on board for any kind of legitimate investigation. I think the investigation into the Russian hacking was perfectly legitimate and justified, and would have
Yeah.
been criminal negligent to not investigate. I don't remember a lot of attention paid to the idea that Russia like necessarily changed votes or committed any kind of voter fraud or hacked voting machines. There was a fringe theory. I don't remember a lot of attention being paid to it on the major networks or by mainstream Democratic politicians.
Yeah.
As for the crime itself, yeah, all sorts of crimes happen in this country. But voter fraud, by its very nature, especially in-person voter fraud, the kind that would be solved by voter ID, is by its nature very high risk and very low reward.
Yeah.
Unless you are somehow fraudulently casting thousands of votes, there is very little chance of voter fraud, or especially in-person voter fraud, making any kind of difference. So by its very nature, you would expect that to be very rare. And then if we look at the evidence, there was a voter fraud commission led by Chris Kobach, who made voter fraud one of his signature issues. And he was appointed to run this task force by President Trump. And he found pretty much nothing. So, and most of these voter fraud investigations that have happened have found that voter fraud is very rare and statistically insignificant and not enough to really sway a national election. Maybe it's swayed some local elections here and there. I'd have to look at that. But yeah, I do think it's rare. There have already been 10 lawsuits that the Trump administration or the Trump campaign has filed that have been thrown out. Privately, we hear that Trump is expressing very limited confidence in his lawyers that are handling this voter fraud issue, which, I mean, Rudy Giuliani was fooled by Borat. So I also agree that I have confidence in Trump's voters, or Trump's lawyers, rather. So we'll see how it goes. Any instance of voter fraud should obviously be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, because people who do that are interfering with the democratic process in a way that is completely abhorrent. I think if you do balance the scales, I would argue that voter suppression efforts, which are justified by an overreaction to the issue of voter fraud, have had more of an effect on elections than actual voter fraud itself. But I do think you would really have to look at the numbers for that.
Yeah, I mean it's going to be interesting. I simply am shocked at how little patience there is. So I appreciate what you're saying. Is it's one of the things where we've got to look into it. We've got to see it. I kept an open mind with the Russian interference in the election, and there were so many different ads that were run, on Facebook trying to convince people to vote online and things like that, which were not legitimate. And looking at how many people fell for that. And I mean, if you look at what Facebook has done this time around, is they've shut down all political advertising, which I'm sure has cost them an enormous amount of money in order to remedy that. And that's a great thing. Was there enough Russian hacking to change the election? No, I don't think that has been shown at all in this, in that election. But it was something certainly worth looking into. And I think it's going to be the case here is we've got to ask that question. But of course, Trump is using that to be able to try to prolong this as much as he can. What I think is going to be interesting is where's the ball, right? Like on what yard line is the ball? And even if you get to a point where you say, hey, there's enough election fraud to put Georgia in doubt and have to do, I mean, they're going to do a recount, but even if it were to sway Georgia, okay, but Trump still loses the popular vote. I mean, we're looking at almost 3%, right? He still looks like he's going to lose Michigan and Wisconsin by pretty large margin. We'll see about Arizona. But we're still talking about a sizable movement that the left was able to mount against the energized base of Trump. And that's got to be reckoned with, right? Whether there's voter fraud or not, you're still dealing with the fact that millions and millions of people came out and voted for Biden, and that has to be reckoned with. And so many people on the right, are just wanting to demonize the entire left, right? And I don't think that's fair either. Let's look at some comments here. So we got a couple. One from Kenneth, who says, too little, too late for Trump. He's had 4 years to get over himself. Love his policy. Not crazy about his inability to convey his message to swing voters. I'm going to miss cheap fuel and booming economy. He did some good things, and I totally agree with you, Kenneth. Like as the conservative on the show, that's nailing it in terms of how I feel. I really do. The Supreme Court justices that he put up, Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, Bennett, I'm huge fans of. I think that's some of the best justices that we've gotten. There definitely is so many economic deals that Trump did overseas that helped our economy. He definitely did some good things, but you're totally right in that he had 4 years to get over himself, and I think that cost him at some point. If he had been the same Trump that we saw in the second presidential debate, the way that Mike Pence portrayed himself in the vice presidential debate, I think we could have had a different result. So I think it was close, but I agree with you. And then we'll look at one more comment here, and I'll get you guys' reaction, and then I'll probably do us for tonight. This is from Lena, who says, voter fraud swayed our election here in Charlotte District 9 2 years ago. And I'll have to look into that one. Maybe you know about that. Go ahead.
I do. I actually live in Charlotte District 9. So that's not exactly the entire truth. Voter fraud was found on both candidates. I forgot the guy's name who was running. I forgot both the guys' names. But it was a long, drawn-out process, and they found significant voter fraud on both sides. On the Republican side, there was a well-known who some attorney or some campaign staffer hired to harvest a couple of votes in a nowhere county here in North Carolina. And on the Democrat side, there was lots of evidence of people voting from out of town who don't live in this district anymore, as well as a lot of dead people voting. So definitely it was a factor in District 9 here a couple of years ago, but it was definitely on both sides as well.
Throughout.
Go ahead.
Like
I said, I would expect that voter fraud would be more common on a local level than it would be at like a national level. When your vote has more of a chance to actually sway an election, statistically, you would expect more fraud to occur.
And that's what happened. This one particular ballot harvester they used, he had actually already served. This is North Carolina politics for you. He had actually already been arrested for doing the same thing, if I remember the story correctly. But he did it for the Democrats, and now the Republicans. North Carolina, what we're going to do.
Yeah, I mean, in Philly, there's same type of thing happened in the 90s, and then there's been reports even as recent as this spring in special elections and that type of thing. But the question is, how much did that actually change, this election as they go through it? I mean, we're talking, some of the Trump's lawsuits are talking about our observers weren't close enough. They were 10 feet and justices let them sit 6 feet. Again, what are we talking about here is there's not as if there's enough to actually overturn, the fact that it could be numbers of 40 or 50,000, surplus for Biden winning Pennsylvania. So there was a point at which I really thought, guys, I thought this was going to be like the Florida election where, I mean, if Trump had won Arizona, North Carolina, Georgia, and it comes down to Philadelphia, right? Like Pennsylvania,
right,
especially Philadelphia, 269 to 260, type deal where it is extremely close down to one location, then, we'd be having probably a much more in-depth conversation. But the reality is that even if, he were to somehow close some of the gap in Pennsylvania, is it going to be enough to sway it? It's unlikely. And even if he did, the reality is that Biden's probably going to win several other states to get him over 270.
There was a moment that I really thought that your prediction of 269 to 269 was going to come true. I was myself for that. I will say, I feel a little bit vindicated about Pennsylvania, because I know we were talking a few weeks ago about how we really expected Pennsylvania to go to be red and to stay red due to the issue of fracking, because that is a big industry there. But then I looked up this poll that said, I think it was 70%, maybe 80% of Pennsylvanians, oppose fracking. So, I think it is. There's a big interest group there that obviously is very dependent on this industry. But I think that most people and most Americans kind of realize that we do have to transition to alternative forms of energy. It is something that may be slow and painful, but needs to be done. Whereas Trump, ever since 2016, has been kind of selling this fantasy of, no, coal's never going away. All of these, forms of energy are never necessarily going away. As far as Kent's comment earlier about a booming economy, I will say the trend over the past several decades has been the economy kind of crashes under a Republican president and then is recovered under a Democratic president. So let's hope that that trend holds true under Biden.
Yeah, I mean, we'll have to see. One of the things that Trump did that we talked about a lot on our shows is how many deals he did overseas and how he kept us out of very costly, expensive wars. I mean, we're on track now to be pulling out of Afghanistan, limiting our presence in Syria and Iraq, pulling out of Africa in a big way, and really centering a lot of the military force around key investments, as well as holding nations accountable within NATO to their commitments. Is that something that Biden continues, or do we wind up in some huge, costly, expensive foreign entanglement? I mean, I remember when Trump first got elected, people were sure that we were going to be in World War III with first North Korea and then Iran, and neither one of those things happened. And so, in that, he was very atypical because when you look at the Bush years, just enormous amounts of money and was spent on these foreign entanglements that just crushes the economy when you have that type of explosion in spending. And so what are we going to see from Biden? It remains to be seen. And I know a lot of people are nervous about that. So we'll see what type of foreign policy he leads. We'll see what type of domestic policy he leads. Obviously, with COVID still being an issue, and that's one of the things I kind of want to leave you guys with is how does that play into the next several months with COVID still being an issue, a vaccine not yet available. How does Biden continue along the progress that frankly Trump has made over the past 6 months of starting to reopen the economy, or does he start to shut it down? Because I could show you guys pictures now, but there's all kinds of celebrations that have happened with Biden supporters. And just no social distancing whatsoever. In some cases, like no mask, dozens of people hugging and be like, "Yay!" He won. What happens to the COVID narrative under a Biden presidency? Does it change? And what happens to the economy as a result? It's kind of an open-ended question for you guys. Appreciate everybody who signed in. Looks like we're up to about 10 people watching live. Thank you guys for all your comments. My last thought too for you guys is, I think this show and what we are doing here is going to become so important because whether you believe that there was election fraud or you think that it's overstated, whoever you voted for, the reality is in this country, there's a very strong American right and there's a very strong American left. They both showed up at the polls. Looking at these numbers right here, if you want to look at it one more time, look at these states between red and blue. People were fired up, they are energized, and they disagree. And so we've got to have a method, a mechanism for people who disagree to come on and to find a way to get this country going again, to be able to discuss with each other. Just like Kenneth was saying, we've got to focus on what's important and not get hung up on people's egos. And that's going to be, I think, the journey that we find ourselves in over the next 4 years. And the fact that the Republicans maintained key aspects of the government shows me that debate's got to continue. Biden can't just roll over everybody, right? He's going to have to deal with the Republican Senate and Supreme Court. And so this kind of mixed government is going to continue, which means the conversation has to continue. So I appreciate you guys being on it. Thank you so much for being on the show. Thanks for hanging with me for the election coverage, Kyle, and taking a look at it, Chris. For you guys that are watching, Refounding Fathers is our chance to talk between a liberal, a conservative, and myself, and a libertarian. We do this all the time. Send us messages if you want us to discuss certain topics. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. We try to do this as often as we can, and love having you guys on it. So, Kyle, thank you so much for being on the show. And then same for you, Chris, as well. Looking forward to having you guys on again.
Thank you.
All right.
Great. Thanks, man.
All right. Happy Sunday night, guys. I am your host, Wes, for Conservatism on Tap, and I'm so excited to be joining you tonight. Gave Jonathan a night off, so normally I have him as my co-host. He's taking care of his family. Got a little sickness, little flu bug that's going around with them, so I'll be joining you tonight, just talking through some of what's been going on with the election. We've gotten so many different people interacting with the page, sending us comments. I've had everybody that I know has an opinion on this election and how it's been playing out. So we're going to talk through some of that tonight. If you've got comments and thoughts, I know you do, go ahead and comment below on this page. I'll bring your comments on here and we can have a little discussion back and forth. To get us started, here are some of the topics that people have been asking us on the page. So we've gotten all these kind of questions going through, and I'm going to just go through each one of these. And again, if you want to comment and let me know what you're thinking tonight, as we start to get into, what is it now, day 4 of the election. I mean, some people thought it was going to be quick and decisive, and now here we are over the weekend, and the media has called the election. But then, as we were just talking on our other show with Chris and Kyle from Refounding Fathers, there's still so many unknowns with this thing. There's the questions of fraud. There is lawsuits. The Supreme Court could weigh in. So many things going on with this election. And so a lot that is left to be decided in terms of how it's going to play out. So here's some questions, though, that I'm going to go through while I wait on your comments to start coming in. The first one, what am I drinking? The second, is the election over? Did fraud occur? And then, was conservatism defeated in this election? And what do we do now? So starting with that first question of what am I drinking tonight? So I've got a little caramel cream ale that I'm enjoying here. And I would tell you guys, it's delicious. And I'm only having one. This is not a night where I'm going to get, plastered or drunk or be depressed or have to drink my sorrows away. I didn't feel that way the first night of the election. And I don't feel that way tonight. At no point did I did. Even when, all the news outlets are saying that Trump is going to be defeated, that it's over, that, I have friends of mine who are saying America has ended. I can tell you right now that's not the case. And I don't feel the need to drink any sorrows away, mainly because there's still so many things to be hopeful about. And there's still so much that's left to be decided. And at the end of the day, I know that America is going to be all right, regardless of who's in the White House. But even aside from that, there are reasons for Republican conservatives to be excited for the future. And I want to go through what those are. So for me, it was a pivotal night. We had been talking about the election for weeks, if not months, on our shows. There was all this buildup, and I'm kind of relieved that, we actually had the election occur, that people got to vote, that we're starting to see some action, some response from the American people, but it's not a night that's going to leave me depressed or sad. Which leads me to my next question. Is the election over? One of the things I was just talking about with Chris and Kyle on Refounding Fathers was how all of the news outlets have already said the election is over. They all, they were, quick to call Arizona. Fox certainly was when it was still very much in doubt. And then CNN and MSNBC were, they were kind of slow to call Arizona, but then it seemed like they were very quick to call the election over, even when states like Georgia are very close. Pennsylvania, is very close. There's all these accusations of fraud. I've seen friends of mine posting things from the 2000 election when Gore was declared the winner. And but then, of course, we know how that played out with Bush actually coming back through. And when you have these lawsuits and what's not going on, it's really going to drag the election out. And so to me, there is kind of a premature call to say that the election's over, and you've seen the news, the mainstream news outlets say there's really nothing to see here. All of the ballots, the process is certified and good. Let's just move on. And, I'm not so quick to do that. I'm not so quick to say that either there was a mass amount of fraud or there wasn't. I think that we have to look into that. We have to take a look, allow the investigators, allow the courts to be able to decide, allow reviews to occur in these pivotal states before we get to a point that an election is over. But even then, I mean, we immediately start to go into the next one. You look at how Republicans made gains in the House. Immediately we go into another election in which Republicans could take the House 2 years from now, right? So we immediately go into this next election. So what I mean to say is that this election, even if it comes down to what the media predicts and Biden takes it, we're not going to be in a situation where it's a landslide And we're quickly going into, what does this mean for the future? What does this mean for the next election and the one after that? And so even if this election is decided, it doesn't mean it's the last that you've heard of Donald Trump. It doesn't mean that Republicans should feel repudiated. There's still a lot to be done with this. And so we're going to be following that. We're going to be talking about it. And I'm looking forward to getting your comments as they come in. So we'll take a look at this. So it looks like I already got one comment here from Lena, but I'll bring that down. Do you think that Trump will run again in 2024? I've heard some talk about that. Lena, I think it's certainly possible. I think that you're going to see the Trump family around. I mean, you've got Donald Trump Jr., you've got Ivanka. I mean, you've got Matt Gaetz, who's the congressman down here in Florida where I live. You've got a whole slew of Trump Republicans. And more than that, you've got a belief system that's behind them. I mean, if you think back to Trump running for office, did he conjure up all of his support, or did he just take advantage of a movement that was already building? And I think it's the second one. I really do. I think that he increased his support. He increased that movement. But I think that Donald Trump really built off of a movement that Rush Limbaugh, had a huge hand in galvanizing. Sarah Palin had been building. And it's this movement of the working class, conservatives, mostly white, although you can see that he expanded that in this election already to more minority voters who are very much against a Washington establishment, a sense of power in D.C., and a sense of dictating to everyday people what they should believe. I think that on the Democrat side, you saw Andrew Yang, I think, has been excellent at trying to explain this movement. He tried to tap into it from an opposing side on the left, talking to truckers out in Michigan and Wisconsin and working class people and saying, look, Trump dialed into something and we need to be aware of it. I actually think that Bernie Sanders is probably closer than many people would care to admit in terms of tapping into similar support, because Bernie Sanders taps into a movement of people who feel oppressed by student loans and massive amounts of debt and an economy with ever increasing cost of living. And so Bernie Sanders taps into the working class. It's very much that type of appeal. And people love the fact that Trump says what he wants, that he doesn't feel the need to be politically correct, and they feel like he connects with them in ways that a politician who always stays within the lines doesn't. That's not going to go away, Lena. That's not going to go away. You're going to continue to hear that from the right, from conservatives for a long time. I think the question for us is not is Trump going to come back or whatever, is what is conservatism? What does the American right do next? Do they change anything, or do they look for someone, whether it's Trump himself or Trump Jr. or somebody like him, that goes just as hard to the right, that's just as politically incorrect, or do they look for someone who's a little bit more reserved, cordial in their tones? And you look at like Mike Pence, and I for one think that Mike Pence did an amazing job on his VP debate. I actually think that Trump did a much better job on his second debate in terms of being kind to the moderator. I thought that was great. I thought that he was much more respectful of Biden, and he allowed him to answer questions, and he still called him out on certain things. But it showed that Trump could be more respectful. And I think that's what people are going to expect. It's that if Trump runs again, or we find someone else who's going to run this type of movement, that they at least have some level of decency and respect for the other side and for the processes and the rules of law. But we'll see if that's actually him. I think it's really going to be determined by how this election ultimately plays out and how long people get stuck on, was there fraud or was not, which is my third question on here. Did fraud occur? And what I said on our page was, fraud occurs in every single election. It's just part of it. It really doesn't take a lot for someone to say, you know what, I'm going to vote for somebody else. You get the ballot in the mail and you vote for everybody in your household, and someone just sends it off, okay? That kind of thing can happen with mail-in ballots. It happens in in-person balloting. It happens with people registering to vote, and then they end up, voting as someone else, right? There's instances, you brought it up in terms of North Carolina, We have seen that in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia. There's a long history of that, and it goes back into the 90s before then. But you saw it even this year. Anytime that there is power up for grabs, there's going to be, and anytime there's an election, and no election is perfect. When you think about the people who are running the election and counting votes, you get a lot of people, some of them retirees who are working for minimum wage to do this, doing the best that they can. But anytime you have a system in place, there's going to be mistakes, especially with the government. And so there's going to be instances where fraud has occurred, where there's issues. However, is there enough to where it actually could sway the election? I don't think that has occurred. I think that's very unlikely that has occurred. If we, what I was saying on the previous show is, if we were just looking at Pennsylvania, if we were just looking at one state and one area, maybe there's enough. We go back to Florida in 2000, but we're not just looking at Pennsylvania. We're looking at Arizona and Georgia and North Carolina and Nevada and Wisconsin and Michigan. And in many of those states, Biden is doing very well, especially in Wisconsin and Michigan, to the point that even if there was a small percentage of fraud, it's doubtful that it's enough. People want to look at a specific software glitch and say, well, that was everywhere. They immediately want to go from some incident to, the macro level. This is affecting the entire process. And that's very unlikely. There hasn't been a lot of proof. I remember I was researching for our show, and I was looking at this guy who, him and his spouse were voting, and he took a selfie as he was putting both ballots for him and his spouse in the box to vote. And he posted that, and immediately the Trump campaign jumped on it and said, this is fraud. This is fraud. When you just couldn't see in the selfie that he had his spouse was with him. And he just thought, hey, yeah, I'm just voting. But putting 2 ballots in the mail for one guy, right, when it's not clear, makes it look like it's fraud. And they jump on that. Does that mean that millions of people are doing that? Of course not. Does it even mean that thousands of people are doing it? Not necessarily. And even in that guy's case, the person that he was putting the ballot in the box for was, had actually filled out his ballot. So it wasn't even fraud in that case. But it only takes a couple stories like that in our day and age for someone to put that on social media and to say, this is systemic. This is happening everywhere. And all of a sudden, people believe it, and now they think that fraud is everywhere in the election. So that's where the courts come in, and they decide, they talk through it, they look at the evidence, they take the time to investigate it. But in our day and age, it doesn't take just a couple incidents before people believe it's everywhere. I don't know if it's everywhere, but I think that we have to have an open mind. I was saying earlier that, when it came to the Russian interference in the election, the question wasn't, did the Russians interfere or did they not? It's as simple as buying Facebook ads and putting them out, which you could do in 2016 to show that they interfered. The question was, did it cause people to vote for a different candidate or to make a lot of mistakes? And how many mistakes are we talking, to the point that did it affect the election one way or the other? And it didn't look like it did. And I doubt that's the case here. But hey, we've got to keep an open mind. And if we just say, yep, election's over and that's it, move on, we're not keeping an open mind. So we got to let this play out. We got to trust the court system to do it, and not just say, hey, the election's over, we don't care. No, we've got to look into it and pay attention to the facts, and not just, an isolated post here or someone, trying to explain it to everyone prematurely. Kind of moving on to the big questions here. The fourth one, was conservatism defeated in this election? And I think that you see a lot of conservatives who are very upset. A lot of conservatives believed that because of the rallies, because of how energized they felt. I mean, here in Florida, we had parades of boats with Trump flags. They saw these people out and about, and they said, listen, Trump's going to win by a landslide. And frankly, in Florida, I mean, it wasn't quite a landslide, but it was pretty definitive. In other states, South Carolina, Texas, he did very well in certain states. And so if you look at like, hey, this is what I thought was going to happen, in certain cases it did. But people out, again, they thought what I see expands to the entire country. And that didn't quite happen, right? We didn't quite see that happen in the Midwestern states that he won last time. And so I think it's shocking to a lot of people that Biden had so much support. You look at particularly the way that Biden ran his campaign, and very few people were as energized for Biden as people were for Trump. But, at the end of the day, so many of those people still voted, and their vote counts no matter how energized or not they circle in the bubble. It still counts as a vote. And for a lot of conservatives, it's shocking to see, just how much of the country leans left, and how divided it is. But I don't think that means conservatism is defeated. For people watching this show, for you guys watching, listening to it or watching it tomorrow, Monday morning, I don't think that conservatism is defeated. I go back to, why am I not drinking like excessively? Because I'm not depressed. I'm not sad. I can be a little bit disappointed, that the Republican didn't win, but I don't feel that conservatism is defeated in this country. As a worldview, I don't believe it can be defeated. I believed it's based on a recognition of truth, of the importance of precedent and history, and I believe it's what works. And so, as fundamentally connected to reality, I don't think conservatism can be defeated. But even in America, I don't think it's defeated, and I'll tell you why. It's because in so many places, you had conservative candidates do very well. You still saw this in many of the states where, frankly, liberals thought they were going to make gains. Democrats thought they were going to take the Senate. That didn't happen. They thought they were going to make gains in the House. They actually lost aspects of the House. And so when we look at certain areas where people, they didn't vote for Trump, but they still voted for Republicans, they still voted for conservatives, I think it's fascinating to see that we still have a divided government. And I think that's a good thing. I'm one of those people who, I don't want to see the government only one belief system, just purely ideologically aligned, because I think that, going back to the founder's vision, when we have opposing interests, we actually do better. And so I think that's what you're going to have with Biden, is he talks about having to work with the other side. He talks about, this election is people trying to come together. Well, we'll see, because he's going to have to do that when he faces a Republican Senate, when he faces the Supreme Court. Looking at a comment here from Yana. Good to see you. Yana's one of my favorite, both of y'all too, Lena and Yana. Y'all are some of my favorite people to have on the page. I love interacting with you. And Yana, you say, interestingly, many of my liberal friends are shocked that it was even this close after 4 years of Trump. And I got to tell you, that makes sense to me. Like there's these bubbles that we live in where we just tend to live and interact and hang out with people who believe like us. And that's just human nature, right? And then you come to find out that there are a whole lot of people who believe differently. And it's interesting that I think what disgusts people about Trump is how he talks to the opposing side, the fact that he's not politically correct, and how he uses his Twitter. But if you look at the people who vote for Trump, there are some that they just love that. They love to see him, the whole bad boy type of, persona. Some people really like that. It makes me think of like Eminem, and like kids growing up in the 90s loved Eminem because he could swear and get away with it, and everybody was trying to stop him, and Eminem would just run around like just, F this and F that and everything else, and the censors were going nuts trying to bleep out every other word, and he was just having fun. And if you were kind of an angry, kid in the 90s, you could live vicariously through that and be like, oh, he has this freedom I don't have. I think a lot of people feel that way about Trump, is like he can vicariously fight the man and flip off whomever he wants and get away with it, and they love that. But there's something deeper in Trump's support, which is that many conservatives feel a connection to the results that he brought, because so many people on the left were saying that Trump's going to end everything because he, acted bad in terms of his Twitter and what he says, that his policy is going to be bad. His Supreme Court justices are going to be equally bad. We're going to be in all these wars, like the economy is going to collapse. There was all this overplaying of what he was going to actually do. And then there's so many results on the conservative side. The fact that we're not in a war with North Korea, we're not in a war with Iran, that he has made responsible decisions with the economy. He did shut down the economy over COVID. And maybe you don't like I personally don't like the way that he thought he was like, oh, it's going to be over by Easter. Of course not. Like he said things that were no doubt like could have been phrased better, but there were certainly results along the way that have been good. Maybe not all, but there's certainly been quite a few, especially for conservatives who are tired of, the part of the aspects of the party or the people within the party who have been quick to just, lay down and take it, or to give up, or to be too accommodating to the left. And so there's so much that conservatives like about Trump, and that's what's kept him in office. If he had governed from the center or from the left, they never would have put up with his behavior. But because he governed from the right, and many would say the far right, they loved it. They loved having him, as their president. And many would say that he was the best president of their lifetime because he actually governed from the right in ways that George Bush never did, in ways that Reagan never did. I mean, you can just go back, right, into people's lives, and you can see how has anybody governed this far to the right, and that's what they love about it, and that's what's propelled him to where he's been. The fact that he's a fighter and he doesn't give up when John McCain was quick to concede his election and, was very, complimentary of Barack Obama. They wanted someone who was tougher than that. And that's what they got in him. And so that's why, you still got, so much support for him 4 years later. Okay. And then my last question here is, what do we do now? And, looks like I got, a couple of you guys are more on the left side on the show, so we can talk. I mean, you guys, I'm sure, are celebrating. You're happy that you got, Biden in office, but you're going to have your work cut out for you because you've still got Republicans in the Senate. You've still got the Supreme Court. You could very well lose the House 2 years from now. So I wouldn't get too happy that like this is some type of like, revival of liberalism or whatever. There's going to be many things, the cabinet, things like that. The executive branch goes to the left. But there's still going to be this need to work with conservatives and the right. So it's a victory for the left, but I wouldn't say it's a complete victory. So you're still going to have your work cut out for you. But more for people on the conservative side is, what do we do now? And again, I don't think we feel disheartened. I think that we start to look at, what are the type of candidates who can mix Trump's spirit and his, relentlessness and his motivation to pursue conservative goals with someone or a behavior style that's a little bit more precise, that's a little bit more specific. Because when Trump does things like tells Hillary Clinton she's wrong, or he does things like interrupt Biden, there's a time and a place for that, right? And I think Mike Pence does this much better than Trump does, is waiting for the right time to really go in there and attack hard. With Trump, it got to the point in many cases where he was just going hard all the time. It was like he's like a one-trick pony. He got to the point where he was just, every time he could, he would interrupt Biden in that first debate. And every time he could, he would say something politically incorrect, right? And I don't think that's the most effective strategy or tactic. I think for conservatives, we have to look at people who believe many of the same things, who pursue conservative goals, pro-life judges, that type of thing, and that have the strength to be able to go hard at Democrats and liberals when necessary, but not people who do it for their own ego or to prop themselves up, who are constantly worried about their numbers, who are constantly bragging about themselves. I think Trump lost support whenever he would do that, whenever he would just, entire commissions to look at voter fraud simply because he lost the popular vote, but obviously won the election. Things like that don't really help the case. So we've got to look at that. I'm going to look at a couple more of your comments. So Yana says, do you think he would have done better had he shown more humility for COVID? Same policies, but different rhetoric. I think that he could have been more optimistic in COVID, because here was the challenge with Trump, is that he was very quick to downplay COVID and to say that it's overblown, it's a simple fix, when it was very obvious that wasn't the case. Now, yes, some statistics were, you could challenge them, they were blown, people talking about, well, this person had pre-existing conditions or they died from something other than COVID, but they had COVID, and so they attributed it up to that. And you can go into all kinds of like CDC and WHO, data checks and things like that. But I think that Trump should have dialed into the American spirit. He should have said, this is a great enemy, and we must band together to fight it. That's something that Reagan did that I thought was very good. He didn't downplay the Soviet empire. In fact, he actually played it up. If you look at how Reagan approached his counter USSR policies, he was actually talking about the Soviet Union, in ways that made it seem like a bigger empire than it was, because there was already evidence during Reagan's time that it was on the verge of economic collapse. And he continued to say, like, this is a great evil, this is great evil, this is great evil. We've got to build ourselves up, even up until the end, to the point that people were shocked when it actually did fall apart politically and, of course, economically after that. And of course, they attribute a great victory to Reagan in doing that. I think that Trump, frankly, should have done the same. He should have said, this is a horrible disease. He talked about it coming from China. Okay. But he should have said, this is going to take everything we've got to beat it, and I'm your man to do it. When he started downplaying COVID-19 and he started saying, it'll be over by Easter. It's nothing to see here. No big deal. It's we've got it under control. I think that was a bad tactic. I think he should have said, we've got a tornado coming, and I am your weatherman who's going to chart you through it, right? When you start to downplay your opponent, pretend like they're not a big deal, you actually downplay the victory. And I think that kind of bit him. I still think, though, that was better than Biden's strategy of making it seem like it was just absolutely horrible and everybody, knew someone who had died and we're just going to somehow have to survive through this. Biden tried, I think, to tap into some of that spirit, but I don't think it was very convincing, and it just kind of came off as a little bit defeatist. So neither one of them, I think, had a very good phrasing of COVID-19, but there's aspects of truth in between the two. So had he done that, though, I think he would have done much better. But he was pretty far from that, and that's not easy to turn around. And even as he got it himself, he was, again, quick to downplay it. He should have been the guy, hey, I'm the example, everybody follow me. He could have had a little bit more inspiring example, I would think. All right, I'm looking at another comment here from Bob Ross, who says, anyone who says, I like war heroes that didn't get captured is not mentally fit. What does getting captured have to do with anything? And you're talking about the McCain wing of the party and John McCain himself, I'm sure, Bob. I didn't like that. I didn't like the way that he treated John McCain. I think it's fair to criticize John McCain, especially when he was alive. I mean, we want to be respectful of the dead. But in Trump's situation, what you criticize John McCain for is being too accommodating of the left. I mean, I went back and I watched John McCain's concession speech to Barack Obama, and I get like, hey, it was clear that Obama won and you want to like show your support for the president. But like, in my opinion, McCain went even beyond that. I mean, he very much was just like, practically saying, I would have voted for this guy, like if I had another chance to think about it, which I get it with Obama. It was a historic election. But I think that you had people booing during his concession speech, whenever McCain mentioned Obama's name. And I don't think McCain ever really catered to that, aspects of the party. I mean, yeah, he picked Sarah Palin as his running mate, but there's all these reports saying that he felt uncomfortable with her and, more importantly, with the aspect of the party that she represented. And I think Trump was probably going against that, saw him as defeatist and stuff. But again, he went too far. He went way too far, saying that. Sure, he captured the press and all that. But, I think that was way too far to attack McCain's service. You can attack him politically. You can attack him and saying, hey, this guy doesn't stand up to the opposing party enough. But to go after, his record in Vietnam, his record as a military officer, it didn't play well to me. And I would say that we have the utmost respect for people who have been prisoners of war. I mean, there are entire tables and ceremonies and things like that for people who go through that, and just the horror of going through that. I worked for a congressman named Sam Johnson, who was also a prisoner of war in Vietnam, in the Hanoi prison. And he was one of the most incredible people I've ever met, Sam Johnson, from Texas. And just being around that guy was incredible. And reading his books about how he survived that, how he came back and became a colonel and all those things, it was incredible to listen to. And that was a horrible, horrible war. So to criticize someone on those grounds, I think he was playing up to the press because he knew he would get people watching it, Bob. But it's not something I agree with. And again, what's the point of that? Because you just lost not just John McCain, but pretty much people who supported him as someone who ran for president. You lost his daughter, who's a commentator on TV, and just enough people that, when you have an election, you might need them. And there certainly was clearly in the election people who voted for Republican congressmen, senators, but not for the president. and that can hurt you when you're fighting for every vote. So I can agree with you there. Again, we've got to find people in the future that capture Trump's spirit of, fighting for conservative values, but don't go that far. I think at some point political incorrectness can become, a problem, even for the right. And we tend to like it because it disrupts the flow that we hear so much from the other side. Okay, so I think that's all I got for now. Thank you guys for signing in. Let me know what questions you got. Let me know if you enjoy this kind of flow for the show. I love being able to interact with you. I know I get a chance to talk to you guys in comments, but it's always fun to go back and forth on this. You've got questions that you want us to deal with. These are just some that I came up with. I'll be happy to put them up here. Again, don't forget to follow us on Facebook. If you've liked us on Facebook, that's awesome. Write us a review on Facebook. I love getting people who are liberals, who are moderates, conservatives across the spectrum, and talking to you guys, learning from you, and giving you my take as well. On YouTube, we've got a channel you can subscribe. Love to put out videos as often as we can. I'm going to try to have one on voter fraud coming out this week, talking about what it is, how often it is, and would it actually change an election. So I think you guys will be interested in that. We're also on Twitter. We're on Instagram. And then, of course, our website at theberkinconservative.com. So thanks so much for dialing in. You guys, thanks for all the comments from Yana, from Bob, from Lena. Again, hope to see you guys next week, and thanks for tuning in.